The air in the Marquis of Ashworth's ballroom was thick with the scent of beeswax and wilting roses, a sweet perfume failing to mask the bitter tang of gossip. They called him the Cold Duke, the silent spectre of Wexford, a man whose title was as grand as the tragedy that haunted it. Lord Alaric stood alone, a pillar of black wool, amidst a sea of pastel silks and glittering jewels, his face an unreadable mask. He had made a promise, a vow of silence paid for in gold and peace. But tonight, that peace would be shattered. He expected the whispers, the fearful glances. What he didn't expect was her. A woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose her voice, a quiet fire about to set his carefully constructed world ablaze. The grand ballroom of Ashworth House was a masterpiece of Georgian excess, a symphony of cream and gold that glittered under the weight of 1,000 candles dripping from a dozen crystal chandeliers. The polished parquet floor reflected the swirling kaleidoscope of society's finest, their silks rustling and jewels flashing like captive stars. Laughter, as light and fragile as spun sugar, mingled with the strains of a string quartet. But beneath it all ran a current of something far less refined malice. It was the lifeblood of the London season, the currency by which reputations were made and more often destroyed. Miss Genevieve Ainsworth felt the chill of that current more keenly than most. She stood near a towering marble column, partially shielded from view, a little grey wren in a flock of peacocks. Her gown, a simple but elegant dress of dove-grey muslin, had been her one indulgence for the season, paid for by months of scrimping from her modest inheritance. As the orphaned daughter of a respected but far from wealthy physician, she occupied a precarious rung on the social ladder. She was invited to such events out of respect for her late father's memory, a courtesy that felt more like a tolerated intrusion. She was neither an heiress to be courted, nor a titled lady to be feared, rendering her largely invisible, a perfect vantage point from which to observe the brutal theatre of the ton. And the star of tonight's tragedy, as he was on so many nights, was Lord Alaric Beaumont, the 5th Duke of Wexford. He was impossible to miss. While other gentlemen sported coats of midnight blue or bottle green, the Duke was a slash of stark black against the room's opulence. Tall and impeccably tailored, he possessed a severe classical beauty that the gossips could not deny, even as they sought to tarnish it. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes were the colour of a winter storm, perpetually cold and distant. He spoke to no one unless directly addressed, and even then his responses were clipped, curt dismissals that discouraged any further conversation. He never smiled, he never danced. He simply existed, a monument of grief and silence in their midst. The whispers followed him like a shroud. "There he is," Genevieve overheard Lady Cowper mutter behind her fan to a younger, wide-eyed debutante. "The Cold Duke. They say he hasn't spoken a civil word since the accident." "The accident with his brother," the girl whispered back, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. "Hush, dear," Lady Cowper chided, though she was clearly eager to elaborate. It was no mere accident. Lord Edmund was the charming one, the heir with the sunny disposition. Wexford was always the shadow. They say he was jealous. They were out on the cliffs at the Wexford estate. A storm rolled in. Only Alaric came back without a scratch on him, while poor Edmund was dashed upon the rocks below. It was a lie, a vicious, twisted lie, and Genevieve's hands clenched at her sides, the fabric of her reticule straining under the pressure. He had not come back without a scratch, but no one knew that. No one but her. She watched him now as he accepted a glass of champagne from a footman, his movements economical and precise. a trio of ambitious mothers undeterred by the rumours attempted to steer their daughters into his path. The Duke's gaze swept over them so devoid of interest or warmth that they visibly faltered, retreating with flushed cheeks and hurried excuses. He was a fortress, and his silence was his rampart. Genevieve knew the reason for that silence. It was a pact, a promise made in the dark, rain-lashed library of his estate 5 years ago. He had stood before her, and her grieving mother, his own grief, a raw, terrible thing, a wound far deeper than the gash on his temple the servants had hastily bandaged. "No one must ever know the truth of what happened," he had said, his voice ragged. "It would tarnish Edmund's memory, and it would ruin you, Miss Ainsworth. The world is not kind to women who find themselves in such compromising circumstances. I will see to your family's finances. Your father was a good man. Your future will be secure. All I ask for in return is your silence." He had called it a request, but it had been a command, born of desperation, and a fierce, misguided need to protect. The Duke's gold had paid off her father's debts and provided her with the small inheritance she now lived on. It had bought her a life free from destitution. It had also bought her silence, a silence that felt heavier each time she heard the lies, each time she saw the condemnation in the eyes of the Tun. She had kept her promise, burying the truth so deep within her that she sometimes feared she would forget it herself. Her gaze drifted back to him. He had moved to the French doors leading out to the terrace, staring into the cool night air, as if the crowded, suffocating ballroom was a prison. She saw the tension in the line of his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. This was not the posture of a guilty man, but of a man bearing an impossible weight. He was a sentinel guarding the memory of a brother he had loved, even at the cost of his own name, his own honor. And as she watched him, a slow, simmering anger began to burn away the cold dread in her heart. He had paid for her silence, yes, but they had not discussed the price of her complicity in the face of such blatant cruelty. The epicenter of tonight's malice was, as it so often was, Lord Harrington, a man whose thinning blonde hair and florid complexion did little to detract from the viperous gleam in his eyes. Harrington had made a sport of tormenting the Duke of Wexford. Some said it stemmed from an old university rivalry, others from a bitter dispute over a parcel of land. Genevieve believed it was simpler. Harrington was a jackal who sensed a wounded lion and could not resist circling. He had gathered his usual sycophants, a gaggle of young lords whose wit was as shallow as their pockets, near the refreshment table. Their voices were deliberately pitched to carry sharp and clear above the music. Genevieve, fetching a glass of lemonade she didn't want, found herself trapped in their conversational orbit, unable to retreat without drawing attention. "Look at him," Harrington began, nodding his head towards the terrace, where the Duke still stood. Wexford brooding as ever. One would think a man who inherited one of the greatest dukedoms in England would manage a smile now and then. "Perhaps he's contemplating new ways to manage his estate," snickered a young baronet named Fitzwilliam. "Or new ways to rid himself of inconvenient siblings." The cruel laughter that followed was like a physical blow. Genevieve flinched, her knuckles turning white around her glass. The group was growing, drawing in curious debutantes and bored matrons who smelled blood in the water. "Fitzwilliam, you are too direct," Harrington chided with false magnanimity. "We mustn't jump to conclusions. It was a tragic accident. The official report said as much. Lord Edmund, bless his adventurous soul, simply lost his footing." He took a dramatic sip of his wine. Of course, the report failed to mention the fierce argument they'd had just an hour before, or the fact that Edmund was set to inherit the lion's share of their mother's fortune, while our dear Duke was left with the entailed estates and their debts. This was a new detail, a freshly minted lie designed for maximum damage. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs. It was one thing to repeat the old vague rumors. It was another to invent motive to paint Alaric not just as a cold survivor, but as a greedy, calculated murderer. No, a young lady, Miss Albright gasped. "Is that true?" "As true as the nose on your pretty face, my dear," Harrington said smoothly, turning his charm on her. "I had it from a former groom at the estate. Fled in terror, he did. Said the look on Wexford's face when he returned alone was not one of grief, but of triumph." The circle of listeners was now a veritable court, and Harrington was the prosecuting counsel, judge, and jury. They glanced from him to the solitary figure of the Duke, their expressions shifting from wary curiosity to open condemnation. They saw the Duke's silence, his refusal to engage not as dignified grief, but as irrefutable proof of his guilt. Genevieve risked a look at Alaric. From this distance she could see his profile stark and unforgiving against the dark garden beyond. He must have heard. He had to have heard. The acoustics of the ballroom designed to carry the music were carrying Harrington's poison just as effectively. Yet he didn't move. His posture remained ramrod straight, his expression unchanged. It was a masterful display of indifference, but Genevieve knew what it cost him. She remembered the tremors in his hands that night in the library, the raw agony in his eyes that no one else ever saw. He was absorbing this punishment, letting the lies rain down on him, all to protect a dead man's honor and a young woman's reputation. Her reputation. "He's a coward," Harrington declared, his voice rising in crescendo. "He let his brother fall and has hidden behind his title ever since. He doesn't deserve the name Beaumont. He doesn't deserve the respect of anyone in this room." The final pronouncement hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The music seemed to falter. The laughter died. All eyes were on the Duke of Wexford, waiting for the explosion, the denial, the challenge that any other man of his standing would have issued without a second thought. Nothing. Alaric turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met Genevieve's across the cavernous room. There was no plea for help, no flicker of emotion. It was a look of cold, hard resignation. He was accepting his fate, the public flagellation he had sentenced himself to 5 years ago. And in that moment, Genevieve knew her own sentence was over. Her silence had been bought, but her integrity had not. The promise he had extracted from her was to protect his brother's memory, but these lies did nothing of the sort. They were destroying Alaric, the living, breathing brother, and she would not be a party to it any longer. The lemonade glass trembled in her hand as she set it down on a nearby table with a soft click. The sound was a gavel marking the end of her silence. As Genevieve took a steadying breath, the world seemed to slow. The faces around Harrington's circle were a blur of smug satisfaction and rapt attention. The Duke remained a statue of indifference. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to turn away, to melt back into the shadows of the marble column and let the moment pass, as she had done 100 times before. To speak out was to invite ruin. She would be labelled a hysteric, an opportunist, a liar. She would make an enemy of Lord Harrington, and perhaps worse, incur the wrath of the very man she sought to defend. But then she thought of her father, a man who had dedicated his life to healing and truth. He would be ashamed of her cowardice. And she thought of Alaric, the boy she had known before the tragedy, who had once shown her a hawk's nest high in the Wexford oaks, his face alight with a rare, gentle enthusiasm. That boy was still inside the cold man, buried under layers of grief and duty. She could not let Harrington and his cronies dance on his grave. Taking a step forward, she moved from the periphery into the heart of the circle. Her movement was so unexpected that the conversation stuttered to a halt. Lord Harrington turned an expression of annoyance on his face at the interruption, which quickly morphed into a sneer of dismissal as he took in her simple gown and unassuming presence. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Lost your way to the spinster's corner." A few of his companions snickered. Genevieve's cheeks burned, but she held his gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring gossip. "Lord Harrington, I find myself compelled to correct you on a matter of fact," she said. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. A nobody, a provincial doctor's daughter, was publicly challenging a viscount. Harrington's eyebrows shot up in amused disbelief. "A matter of fact, my dear girl. I deal in truths. You, I imagine, deal in needlepoint and watercolors. Pray do not trouble your pretty little head with matters that do not concern you." "A man's honor concerns everyone in this room," Genevieve retorted, her courage surging. "And you have just slandered the honor of the Duke of Wexford. He did not return from the cliffs without a scratch, as you so gleefully claimed." The silence in the ballroom was now absolute. The string quartet, sensing the shift in mood, had trailed off into a discordant scrape. Every eye was on her. Across the room she saw Alaric finally turn fully from the terrace doors, his body rigid with shock. This was not part of their agreement. Harrington's amusement curdled into irritation. "And how would you know Miss Ainsworth? Were you there?" he scoffed. "My father was there," she stated, her voice ringing with conviction. "Dr. Robert Ainsworth. He was the physician summoned to Wexford Hall that night. He attended the Duke himself." She let that sink in, before delivering the final irrefutable blow. "He stitched a wound, my lord, that required 17 sutures hidden just beneath the Duke's hairline where no one would see it. A wound he sustained when he fell, trying to catch his brother's hand." The detail was so specific, so clinical and unexpected, that it stunned the crowd. It was not a vague defense of character, but a presentation of evidence. The story of a callous brother watching his sibling fall was instantly and irrevocably damaged by the image of a man bearing a significant hidden wound from a failed rescue attempt. Harrington was speechless, his ruddy face paling. He had been caught in a lie, not by a peer who could be challenged to a duel, but by a woman armed with nothing but the truth. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking for a verbal weapon, and finding none. Genevieve did not press her advantage. She had said what needed to be said. She cast one last look at Lord Harrington's slack-jawed face and the stunned expressions of his audience before turning her back on them. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She felt hundreds of eyes following her as she walked not back to her pillar, but towards the edge of the room seeking escape. Before she could reach the antechamber, a low voice stopped her. "Miss Ainsworth." It was the Duke. He had crossed the vast expanse of the ballroom floor, a feat that felt as significant as an army crossing a continent. He stood before her, his storm-grey eyes no longer distant and unreadable, but blazing with a complex mixture of fury, astonishment, and something else she couldn't dare to name. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The Cold Duke had spoken, and it was to her. He did not wait for an answer in the public eye. With a hand firmly on her elbow, Alaric steered Genevieve away from the gawking crowd, his touch a shocking brand of heat through the fine muslin of her sleeve. He guided her through a side door and into a deserted library, the air cool and smelling of old paper and leather. The distant sounds of the party were a muted hum, a world away from the charged silence that now enveloped them. He released her as soon as the heavy oak door clicked shut, turning to face her. The candlelight from a nearby candelabra cast stark shadows across his face, making his expression seem even more severe. The cold mask was back in place, but his eyes were still turbulent. "That was the agreement, was it not?" He began, his voice tight with control. "Your family's security in exchange for your silence. An agreement you have just publicly and spectacularly violated." Genevieve lifted her chin, her fear warring with her indignation. "The agreement was to protect your brother's memory. Lord Harrington's lies were not protecting Edmund. They were creating a monster out of you to entertain his friends. Was I supposed to remain silent for that? Your Grace." "Yes," he bit out, the single word sharp as a shard of glass. "That is precisely what you were supposed to do. Do you have any idea what you have just unleashed? You have not silenced the gossip, Miss Ainsworth. You have merely changed its subject. From me to you. By tomorrow morning, every drawing room in London will be buzzing. Who is this Miss Ainsworth? What is her connection to the Duke? Why was she privy to the details of that night? They will pick you apart." "Let them," she retorted, surprised by her own fire. "I have lived with their whispers and sideways glances my entire life, because I have no title and no fortune. Their opinion means nothing to me. But, Your Honour," she trailed off, her throat tightening. "My honour is my own affair," he said, his voice dropping. He paced away from her, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound agitation that shattered his usual composure. "I chose this path. I chose silence." Why she asked the question she had longed to ask for 5 years. Why bear it all? Edmund would not have wanted you to live like this. He loved you. Alaric stopped pacing and turned to her, his face a landscape of pain. Edmund was reckless. He said, his voice raw. He was charming and vibrant, and he lived more in his 20 years than most men do in 80. But he was careless, with his heart, with his money, with his life. He walked to the unlit fireplace, resting one hand on the cold marble mantel. That night, the argument Harrington mentioned. It was real. I had just discovered Edmund had gambled away a staggering sum of money promised to a man who was little better than a loan shark. He was to pay it by the end of the month, or the consequences would be severe. He was terrified. That adventurous climb on the cliffs wasn't an adventure. It was a foolish, drunken attempt to retrieve a peregrine falcon's egg from its nest on a wager. He thought the prize money would solve his problems. Genevieve listened, her heart aching for the two brothers. She had known they had fought, but not the reason. I followed him. Alaric continued, his gaze fixed on the empty grate. I begged him to come down. The storm was coming. In the rocks were slick with sea spray. He laughed at me, called me a dull, cautious bore. He said I didn't know how to live. His voice cracked on the last word. He slipped. I lunged for him. I caught his hand, but I couldn't hold on. My head hit the rock face as I fell back. By the time I could see straight again, he was gone. He finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. When I carried him back to the house, and your father was tending to my head, all I could think of was his legacy. If the truth came out that the Golden Lord Edmund died in a foolish, drunken attempt to pay a gambling debt, his memory would be ruined. His name would be a cautionary tale told in taverns. I wanted him to be remembered as the bright, shining soul he was not, as the fool he was in his final moments. So I constructed the story of a tragic accident, and I imposed silence on the only other person who knew he was not alone when he fell. You weren't just a witness, Genevieve said softly. You were there because Edmund had asked you to meet him. You were trying to stop him even before he left the house. Alaric's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. How did you know that I was in the garden that afternoon? She confessed, her own secret tumbling out. I overheard you both. I heard Edmund tell you to meet him at the old watchtower on the cliffs. I saw you go after him. That's why my father and I were on the path that night. I was so worried I convinced him to walk with me. We were on our way to find you when we heard the fall. Understanding dawned on his face, followed by a wave of crushing guilt. My God, he whispered. I made you carry that burden as well. I silenced you to protect you from the scandal of being a witness, never realizing you were so much more. I never asked. I just commanded. He had promised silence to protect his brother's legacy and her reputation. But in doing so, he had built a cage for himself and locked her in it with him. Her defense of him in the ballroom was not just a defense. It was the rattling of the bars, a desperate cry for a truth that refused to stay buried. They returned to the ballroom separately. Genevieve slipped back to her forgotten corner, her mind reeling, while Alaric re-emerged from the library, and to the astonishment of everyone present, retrieved a glass of brandy and stood by the fireplace, making it clear he had no intention of fleeing the scene his unlikely champion had created. The atmosphere in the room had changed irrevocably. The whispers were now frantic, a buzzing hive of speculation. Lord Harrington, having recovered his composure, was attempting to paint Genevieve as a fantasist, a woman of little consequence seeking the Duke's attention. But her story had been too specific, too compelling. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was taking root in the fertile soil of the Ton's imagination. From her vantage point, Genevieve watched Alaric. The wall of ice around him seemed to have developed a crack. He was no longer just observing the room. He was seeing it. He watched the way Lady Danbury, a notorious gossip, cornered a younger woman and whispered furiously behind her fan, their eyes darting towards Genevieve. He saw how Harrington's cronies now looked at him with a sliver of uncertainty instead of pure contempt. Most importantly, he saw what his silence had cost her. Men who had never before noticed her existence were now staring, their gazes ranging from curious to lascivious. Women who had once dismissed her were now assessing her as a threat, a rival, an unknown quantity, who had somehow breached the walls of the impenetrable Duke of Wexford. He had sought to protect her from scandal, and instead, he had made her the center of one. The weight of his 5-year penance suddenly felt less like a noble sacrifice and more like a fool's errand. He had protected Edmund's memory, but at what cost he had allowed his own name to be blackened, his own life to become a half-life of isolation and grief. He had thought his silence was a shield for Genevieve, but now he saw it was a burden, one she had just thrown off at great personal risk. Her courage made his own silent suffering seem like a profound act of cowardice. He felt an unfamiliar emotion stirring within him, rage. Not the cold, repressed anger he had nurtured for years, but a hot, righteous fury. It was directed at Harrington, at the whispering gossips at the society that fed on ruin. But most of all, it was directed at himself for believing that silence was synonymous with strength. Genevieve, meanwhile, felt the full force of her actions. Mrs. Albright, whose daughter had listened so intently to Harrington's lies, now approached her. "Miss Ainsworth," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Such a spirited defense. One must be so careful not to appear too familiar with a gentleman's affairs. It can lead to such unfortunate conclusions." The warning was clear. She had overstepped. She had broken the unspoken rules that governed women of her station. Her reputation, the very thing Alaric had tried to preserve, was now hanging by a thread. But as she met the woman's condescending gaze, she felt no regret. Only a strange, liberating sense of calm. She had spoken the truth, and whatever the consequences, she would face them. The Marquis of Ashworth, the host of the evening, began to call for attention, tapping a knife against his glass. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention for a moment, it is time for a toast." As the room quieted, Lord Harrington saw his opportunity to reclaim control of the narrative. He moved to the center of the floor, a malicious smile playing on his lips. He was going to finish what he had started, using the public forum of a toast to discredit Genevieve and cement the Duke's guilt once and for all. Alaric saw it too. He saw the predatory gleam in Harrington's eye, the way he positioned himself to address the entire assembly. He saw Genevieve standing alone and vulnerable, bracing for the next assault. And he knew his silence was over. He had promised himself he would never speak of that night, never defend himself. But he had never promised he would stand by and let them destroy her. He began to move from the fireplace, his path a direct line towards Harrington, a collision course with the truth. But before he could reach him, Genevieve acted first. She took a step forward, her chin high, her gaze locked on Harrington, ready to face the storm she had created. She would not let him have the last word. She would defend the Duke of Wexford one more time, even if it meant her own complete and utter ruin. A toast, Lord Harrington boomed, raising his glass and commanding the attention of the room, his eyes small and glittering, fixed on Alaric with triumphant malice, before sweeping over to pin Genevieve with a look of pure contempt. A toast to loyalty, a quality so rare and precious. Loyalty to one's friends, to one's family. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. And a toast to memory, to ensuring that the legacies of those no longer with us are accurately preserved. His smile was a predator's grimace. We have heard some inventive stories tonight. A tale of a hidden wound spun by a young woman of no particular consequence. A murmur went through the crowd. Harrington was not just challenging the Duke, he was publicly shaming Genevieve, framing her as a liar and a social climber. One has to wonder at the motives behind such a vivid and unsupported claim. Harrington continued, his voice resonating with false sincerity. Perhaps a desire for attention, or perhaps she was put up to it by a guilty man desperate to rewrite history, a man who stood to gain a title, a fortune, and everything that came with it from his brother's convenient and untimely demise. He was painting a masterpiece of slander, each word a carefully chosen brushstroke. He was twisting Genevieve's act of courage into a sordid conspiracy. But before the poison of his words could fully seep into the minds of his audience, Genevieve spoke. She did not shout. She did not weep. She simply moved into the clear space in the center of the room, her grey dress a stark statement of seriousness amidst the frivolity, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner. "The claim is not unsupported, Lord Harrington," she said. The entire ballroom turned towards her. Alaric, who had been striding forward to intercept Harrington, stopped dead, watching her in awe. "My father, Doctor Ainsworth, kept meticulous records," Genevieve announced, her voice gaining strength with every word. "His medical journals detail every patient, every diagnosis, every treatment. And on the night of August the 14th, 5 years ago, he made an entry detailing his emergency summons to Wexford Hall, where he treated the current Duke for a head wound consistent with a heavy blow against rock and for severe rope burns on both of his hands." A collective gasp went through the room. Rope burns. The detail was damning. Harrington's face went white. "Lies, you are a fantasist, am I?" Genevieve challenged, taking another step forward. "Those journals are in a safe box at my solicitor's office, Mr. Davies of Lincoln's Inn Fields. I invite any interested party to request a viewing. But you don't need to, because there is more to the story you so conveniently omitted." She turned from Harrington to address the captivated room. "Lord Harrington speaks of loyalty. Let me speak of the loyalty between brothers. Lord Edmund was in trouble. He had fallen into debt, a terrible gambling debt, to a man who had threatened him. He made a foolish wager to climb the cliffs that night, hoping to win enough to save himself. His Grace did not argue with him out of jealousy. He followed him out of fear. He followed him to save him." She looked directly at Alaric now, her eyes pleading with him to let the whole truth be known. He didn't just fall trying to catch him. He had tied his own belt to his brother's wrist, trying to haul him back to safety. The rope burns my father treated were from the leather of that belt cutting into his flesh as he fought with all his strength to keep from losing his brother to the sea. He failed, and for 5 years he has carried not only the grief of that failure, but the weight of a silence intended to protect his brother from the shame of his final desperate hours. She had laid it all bare: the gambling debt, the foolish wager, the desperate rescue, the hidden wounds, both physical and emotional. She had not just defended the Duke. She had revealed the full, heart-breaking scope of his sacrifice. She had given him back his honor, his history, his truth. The ballroom was utterly still, the silence profound. Every guest was frozen, staring at the lone woman in grey, who had single-handedly dismantled a 5-year-old scandal and exposed the nobility of the man they had all scorned. Lord Harrington stood gaping, his plot in ruins, his character exposed as nothing more than a malicious gossip. Genevieve's part was done. She had said everything. She stood trembling slightly from the adrenaline, waiting for the judgment of her peers. But the first judgment, the only one that mattered, was about to be delivered. Into that deafening silence, a new sound emerged. The slow, deliberate tread of polished leather on parquet flooring. Alaric moved from his position, walking not towards the humiliated Lord Harrington, but towards Genevieve. He stopped directly in front of her, the entire world of London society, their audience. The cold mask was gone, utterly and completely. In its place was a man stripped bare, his emotions naked for all to see. Grief, gratitude, and a fierce, blazing admiration warred for dominance in his stormy grey eyes. He looked at Genevieve as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as the doctor's quiet daughter or the keeper of his secret, but as the bravest person he had ever known. He raised a hand and gently, almost reverently, brushed a stray curl from her cheek. Then he turned to face the room. When he spoke, his voice was not the clipped, dismissive tone they were used to. It was a voice rough with disuse, but resonant with authority and raw emotion. "Every word Miss Ainsworth has spoken," the Duke of Wexford declared, his voice ringing through the hall, "is the absolute truth." He did not stop there. He looked at Lord Harrington, his gaze now glacial. "For 5 years I have allowed you, and others like you, to whisper your poison. I did it to protect the memory of a brother I loved, a man who, despite his flaws, was a better man than you will ever be. My silence ends tonight." He began to unfasten the cuff of his immaculate white shirt. He pushed the sleeve up past his wrist, revealing the faint, silvery tracings of old scars across his palm and forearm. The rope burns Miss Ainsworth mentioned, a permanent reminder of how hard I fought. Then he lifted his hand to his temple, pushing back his dark hair, to reveal a pale, thin scar just at the hairline, exactly where Genevieve had said it would be. And the price of my failure. The last vestiges of doubt in the room evaporated. This was not a story. This was proof etched into the Duke's very skin. Alaric let his sleeve fall. He turned his back on Harrington and the rest of the room, giving his full attention to Genevieve. He took her hand in his grip warm and steady. "You, madam," he said, his voice now soft for her alone, yet carrying to all. "You have shown a courage and integrity I have not witnessed in a decade. You have defended a man who did not deserve your loyalty, and you have given me back a part of myself I thought was lost forever." He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of profound respect and burgeoning affection that sent a fresh shockwave through the assembled guests. It was a courtly, romantic gesture from a man they had believed incapable of warmth. "I promised you security in exchange for your silence," he said, his eyes holding hers. "I now see what a terrible bargain that was. Allow me to offer a new one." He did not release her hand. Instead, he tucked it firmly into the crook of his arm, a public and unmistakable gesture of possession and protection. He looked out at the sea of stunned faces. "Miss Ainsworth is under my protection," he announced, his voice booming with the full power of his ducal authority. "Any slight against her is a slight against me. Any rumor whispered will be met with the full force of my family's influence. Is that understood?" It was not a question. It was a decree. Lord Harrington looked as if he might faint. The Cold Duke of Wexford was not only speaking, he was roaring, and he was doing it all for the quiet girl in the grey dress. The story was no longer about a tragic death. It was now about a breathtaking, impossible love, born in a gilded ballroom from a promise of silence that had finally gloriously been broken. The Duke's decree hung in the air as tangible and unbreachable as the walls of the ballroom themselves. For a long moment, the only sound was the collective breath of 200 people being held in suspense. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the room erupted. It was not a sound of applause or condemnation, but a low, feverish hum of whispers, a tidal wave of gossip breaking against the shores of society. Fans snapped open with sharp, judgmental cracks. Eyes wide with shock and thrilling speculation darted between the Duke the Doctor's daughter on his arm and the ashen-faced Lord Harrington, who now looked like a man shipwrecked in the middle of a ballroom. Alaric ignored them all. His world had contracted to the small, steadying presence of the woman beside him. He could feel a slight tremor in the hand he held tucked in his arm, and a fierce, primal instinct to shield her from the storm she had unleashed on his behalf rose within him. He had spent 5 years as a ghost in these rooms, an untouchable spectre. Now he was flesh and blood again, and his first act was to be her fortress. Lord Ashworth Alaric said, his voice cutting cleanly through the rising din. The Marquess, a portly man whose face was a comical mask of bewilderment, started at being addressed. "My thanks for your hospitality. Miss Ainsworth and I shall be taking our leave." He gave a slight, formal bow of his head, a gesture so perfectly executed it was an act of defiance. It said nothing that happened here was untoward. This is my new reality. Adapt to it. He then turned, not waiting for a reply, and began to lead Genevieve towards the grand arched doorway. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea. Ladies who had earlier cut him dead now offered tremulous, uncertain smiles. Gentlemen who had sneered behind their hands now stood a little straighter, their expressions a mixture of fear and newfound respect. Genevieve felt their stares like 1,000 tiny pinpricks on her skin. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, focusing on the rhythmic tap of Alaric's polished boots on the floor, the solid strength of the arm linked with hers. She felt strangely calm, suspended in a bubble of disbelief. The world she had known, with its rigid rules and cruel certainties, had just been turned on its axis, and she was standing at the epicenter. As they passed Lady Coper, the woman's mouth was agape, her earlier pronouncements about the Cold Duke, now rendered utterly foolish. Beside her, Mrs. Albright clutched her daughter's arm, her expression one of horrified recalculation. She had warned Genevieve against appearing too familiar. Now that familiarity was backed by the power of a dukedom. Genevieve had not just broken the rules, she had rewritten them with the Duke as her co-signatory. Their progress through the ballroom felt like it took an eternity. By the time they reached the cooler air of the grand entrance hall, Genevieve's legs felt unsteady. The butler, his professional impassivity shattered, nearly dropped his staff as he saw them. "Your Grace's carriage," Alaric commanded, his voice steady. "At once, Your Grace," the man stammered, scurrying to do his bidding. They stood in a pocket of charged silence, waiting. The sounds from the ballroom were a distant roar, the sound of a beast digesting the incredible meal it had just been served. Genevieve finally dared to look up at Alaric. The harsh protective mask he had worn in the ballroom had softened. In the gentler light of the hall she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, but also a profound, soul-deep relief. It was as if a suit of armor he had been forced to wear for years had finally been removed, and he was just now feeling the ache of the muscles that had held it up. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and laced with a concern that made her heart flutter. She managed a small nod. "I believe so. And you?" A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips, a sight so rare it was startling. "I believe, Miss Ainsworth, that I am better than I have been in 5 years, though I suspect my ears will be burning from here to Scotland by morning." The carriage, a magnificent black lacquered coach bearing the Wexford crest, rolled to a stop before them. A footman sprang down to open the door. Alaric helped her inside, his hand, warm and firm at her back, before following and settling on the velvet squab opposite her. The door closed, shutting out the world, the lights of Ashworth House, and the prying eyes of the London Tun. Inside the cocooning darkness of the coach, the silence was different. It was no longer a weapon or a shield, but a space to breathe. The carriage lurched forward, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones the only sound. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. Genevieve stared out the window at the passing gas lights, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and exhilaration. She had done it. She had spoken the truth. What came next, she had no idea. Genevieve. He said her name for the first time, without a title, and the sound of it spoken in his deep, quiet voice was both intimate and unnerving. She turned from the window to face him. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "I find myself." At a loss for words, he began a wry twist to his mouth. A rather ironic state of affairs, all things considered. "Thank you" seems a pathetic and inadequate sentiment for what you did tonight. "You don't have to thank me, Your Grace," she whispered. "I only did what was right." "No," he countered firmly. "You did what was courageous, what was selfless, what I was too steeped in my own grief and misguided pride to do for myself. You walked into the fire for me. I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." He paused, his gaze searching hers in the gloom. "But I must also beg your forgiveness. I put you in an impossible position. That pact of silence. It was a selfish thing demanded by a man half mad with grief. It protected Edmund's memory, perhaps, but it cost you and I both a piece of our souls. Can you forgive me for imposing it upon you?" Tears pricked at her eyes. "There is nothing to forgive. I understood why you did it. I wish you hadn't felt you had to carry it all alone." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was not a gesture of public ownership, like in the ballroom, but one of simple, profound connection. "I did not know how to do anything else," he admitted, his voice raw with the confession. "After Edmund, it was as if all the colour and sound had been bled from the world. Silence felt like the only appropriate response, a penance. But tonight you showed me that silence is not a tribute. It's an absence. You filled that absence with the truth." He looked down at their joined hands. "When I stood on that terrace listening to Harrington's lies, I felt nothing but the same cold resignation I have felt for years. But then you spoke, and it was like the first crack of lightning in a storm that had been brewing for half a decade. And when you stood up to him the second time, knowing what it would cost you, I knew I could not remain silent for another second. Not if it meant leaving you to face the consequences alone." He lifted his gaze back to hers. "My declaration in the ballroom was not a tactic, Genevieve. It was a vow. Your name is now linked with mine. Your reputation is my responsibility. I will not allow you to suffer for the kindness you have shown me." A new kind of fear mingled with a dizzying hope began to bloom in her chest. What does that mean?" "It means things will be different now," he said simply. "For both of us. It means first that I will formally call upon you tomorrow if you will allow me. I will not have you hidden away. I want London to see you on my arm, not as a curiosity, but as my honoured guest, as my friend." He tested the word as if it were a foreign language. "It means I intend to crush Lord Harrington, not with a duel, but with the full weight of social and financial ruin. And it means," he squeezed her hand gently, "that I am asking for the chance to get to know the woman who saved me from myself. Not as the keeper of my secrets, but as Genevieve Ainsworth. If she is willing." The carriage was slowing, drawing up before the modest but respectable townhouse she called home. The journey was over. A new one was about to begin. The weight of his title, his fortune, his entire world felt immense, but the warmth of his hand in hers, the sincerity in his storm-grey eyes, felt real and grounding. She had spoken out tonight to restore a man's honour. She had not expected that in doing so, she might find the beginning of her own future. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I am willing, Alaric." And so the silence that had shrouded the Duke of Wexford for 5 long years was shattered not by a challenge or a duel, but by the quiet courage of a woman who chose truth over safety. In that single glittering night, reputations were unmade and remade. Lord Harrington became a social pariah, his malice exposed for all to see, while the Cold Duke was reborn as a man of deep honour and profound passion. For Genevieve Ainsworth, a life of invisibility was over. By his side, she was no longer the doctor's overlooked daughter, but the woman who had given a duke back his voice, and in doing so, had found her own. Theirs was a love story forged in secrets and sealed in public defiance, a powerful reminder that the most formidable walls can be brought down by a single voice speaking the truth. What did you think of Genevieve's incredible bravery? Could you have done the same? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend who loves a story of justice, and subscribe for more tales where hidden truths change everything.